The Kutasich is Chelek Chaf Aleph Tisa Beis Lili Nishmas of Yosef Benyamin Ben Reb Menashe Kaltman. A Rashi Sicha that in the beginning seems like a very technical Rashi Sicha, and then when we get to the Yena Shal Torah, we see how the precision of Rashi is not just in explaining the Pshat, but even when it comes to teaching us a lesson in our own personal Avodah, every single word that Rashi uses is consistent with the messages in our serving Hashem, in our growing in our own Avodah. Actually, incredibly fascinating as it all ties together. Let us begin. We are talking about two psukim in Parshas Kisisa, on which Rashi says a pirush that seemingly is exactly the same. And the question is going to be, why would Rashi repeat himself, especially within the same parsha? It's been discussed many times, the total precision of Rashi on Torah. Including in this is that generally speaking, Rashi does not repeat himself twice. Similar to what Rashi says with regards to the Mishkan and Parshas Vayakel, I'm not going to explain everything all over again because I already explained it when they were instructed about this the first time around. What would be the exception? The exception would be if this second time something new is being introduced, an extra explanation, then for that Rashi would repeat himself. Another reason that Rashi would repeat himself, then zwischen die zwei Psukim is da hefsek von kama v'kama parshias. V'alachas kama v'kama in another chumash. If many parshias have passed since the first time he explained it, or certainly if we're in a new chumash, and then Rashi would repeat himself, maybe concisely, briefly, even if nothing new is being added. As Ken Zain, as their Talmud Alemid gedenken in sein Pidus von ersten Mal, it's possible that the student learning forgot or doesn't remember what he learned the first time because so many parshias have passed, then Rashi might repeat himself. Alachas kam v'kama, but this idea that Rashi does not repeat himself is most certainly the case in ein parsha gufa, within the same parsha. Is nit mistaber as man soll vergessen was Rashi hat mefarish gewinnt mit etliche psukim frier. It's not logical to say that the student is going to forget that which Rashi had just said a few psukim previously. Unbemele is Pasha does Rashi darf nit iberchaz in den Pirush on ateses chidush bir, and obviously if you're in the same parsha just a few psukim later, Rashi has no need to repeat himself unless he's going to be introducing something new and different. Al Pisa down from first name of parsha say no. So based on this introduction, you have to understand in our parsha, wo me gefindt as Rashi chazet iber dem selben Pirush zweimal, where we find that Rashi repeats himself twice. In the first time is Perek Lamed Gimel Pasuk Beis, where the Pasuk says, V'shalachti lefanecha malach, I'm going to send before you an angel. V'geirashti, and I will banish. Esaknaini, Oemeri, V'achiti, V'aprizi, Achi, V'evusi. The Pasuk says over here 6 nations and does not mention Girgashi. Is Rashi maitik from pasuk v'girashti saknaini? It's Rashi quotes the words v'girashti saknaini. This, of course, is going to be relevant. The Dibur HaMaschil always tells us so much about the Rashi. Und his mefarish, and Rashi says shisha umaysein. There's 6 nations here, or they are 6 nations. V'hagirgashi omad upana mipnei emelov, and the Girgashi stood up and left from before them, may a love on their own accord. So that's what Rashi says. Why, when the Abish is telling us that he's going to send us an angel to help us get rid of these nations, does it not mention Girgashi? Because the Girgashi is going to go away by themselves. Then there's another pasuk in Perek Lamed Daled Pasuk Yudalef, where the pasuk is telling us not to learn from the other nations and to destroy their altars and to destroy their idols, etc. The pasuk says, again, I will banish from before you the Amori, the Knaini, and continues with the other 6 nations. And doesn't mention Girgashi. Is it Hashemaitika Sa'amori v'Gemes? Rashi quotes the words Sa'amori, Unis Mefarish, and explains Vavumis Yeshkan. There are 6 nations mentioned here. Ki ha-Girgashi Amadu Panam Ipneam, because the Girgashi left from before them, evacuated. Ist nicht verstandig. Was darf Rashi überchas in demselben Pirush als zweiten Mal? Seemingly, these 2 Rashis seem almost identical. Why would Rashi have to repeat himself a second time? That's the key question of this Sikha. Base is da Mefarshim v'zagin. So certain Mefarshim, the Maskil David says as follows. As Rashi gaat ist über den Pirush tefar, weil beim zweiten Mal redt der Pasuk at der Eberste be'atzma yelich legarsham, in the first pasuk, it's talking about Vishalachti lefonecha malach. I'm going to send a malach, an angel ahead of you to help you out in getting rid of these nations. The second pasuk says Hinini goyrish. I, Hashem, is going to banish these nations. So the Mefarshim say that the second pasuk is talking about the Eibishter, and the Rebbe is Rashi Mefaresh, and therefore Rashi says, as Afal Pikein vet in dem prat nizan kin chiluk. That despite the fact that the Eibishter is here, still it's going to be the same situation as when we're talking about a malach. What's that going to be? And even if I am banishing them from before you, it doesn't mean that they'll be chased away and there'll be no need for war. Means that there'll be a war, but the Eden are going to win the war because the malach is there. So I might think that because Hashem is there, there's no need for war at all. They'll be able to be banished from the land without war. So therefore comes Rashi to say that only the Girgashi is going to go away, nor Blois Girgashi, only Girgashi is going to go away by themselves. We said before, and the other nations is still going to be a war. That's how the Mefarshim explain. That I might have thought that by Hinini Goyrish, when you talk about the Eibishter is powerful enough to cause that there'll be no need for war at all. Comes Rashi and says that Girgashi Amadu Panrapneam, the Girgashi left on their own, or is going to leave on their own. But the rest of the nations is going to be done through war. It's just that the Eibishter is going to help them win the war. And that's why Rashi says it again, to clarify that nothing changed in the promise that the Eibishter is making. Das aber nicht glattig. Says the Rebbe, this mefayrish, the way the Maskil David explains this, is not smooth. It's not easily understood. Varum Aleph number 1. Der Chiddush, as the Vavum is von Lita vegem yatzmam, hafilu ven pana yelecho. This Chiddush, this idea that the 6 nations will not go away by themselves, even with the Eibishter's presence, stated in Rashi. Rashi doesn't say this. He only talks about why the pasuk doesn't say a Girgashi. And this we already know. If when the Malach is there, Girgashi goes away. For sure when the Eibishter is there, Girgashi goes away. But that's the only thing that Rashi touched upon. Rashi only touched upon why Girgashi is not mentioned. Rashi doesn't talk about why the other nations are mentioned, or whether there would be a war or wouldn't be a war with them. So to say such a chiddush in Rashi, that Rashi is saying that there won't be a war, is Rashi doesn't say that. Base, another point. If the pasuk was talking about the war and saying that the Yidden will win because the Eibishter is with them, is move on. The Bavaran is from the Pirush, and then we would understand why Rashi has to say something. Even though the Eibishter is walking amongst us, we would still need a war. Excluding Girgashi, which would go away on their own. But in Pasuk, not only does Rashi not say this, the Pasuk isn't discussing Milchama. Parshas Lashon HaPasuk is mashma, as the Redman they're going to besed in Eifen HaKibush. And if you look at the pasuk, I'm going to help you out. I'm going to get rid of it for you. I'm not going to just rely on a malach. It implies that this will be a better form of conquering. Ulefia now, kommt durch, als der Pirush is in Stira li'iloi von hineni geres lipanecha. Weil euch da ist nur gegoshi amad upon v'pneim. And not only that, but it seems that this kibush is the same. This conquering is the same as the previous one. It seemed to imply from the pasuk that it's going to get better, and it doesn't get better. So we have two questions on the Maskil David. Number one, Rashi doesn't say what you're saying. Number two, the pasuk isn't even talking about Milchama. Not only that, it seems from Rashi now that this pasuk is saying the same thing as the previous pasuk, when we would have thought that this pasuk is upping the ante. So the question becomes now, if according to the Maskil David, Rashi is telling us that only the Gegashi is going to leave, and there's going to have to be a war with the other 6 nations, then you have not improved the form of kibush. You haven't made it any better. We're in the same place. So not only does the Maskil David not make it better because we now understand what Rashi is saying, now it makes it worse, because it now took the pasuk that thought that the Eibishter is going to be helping us out, and it seems that it's not going to be helping us out any more than the Malach will. So therefore, the Pirush of the Maskil David is now refuted. We don't see that Pirush in these psukim. We don't see it in Rashi. We're back to our original question: why does Rashi tell us the same thing twice? The kasha wird noch starker, and this question is actually even stronger. If this is a necessary thing to touch upon, when the pasuk says 6 nations, we have to explain why it doesn't say the 7th when it's well known from the very first Rashi in Torah, for example, that there are 7 nations. How does Rashi gedacht befahren sein, wenn der Pasuk rechnet us nur vav zum ersten Mal al kulpanim befahren sein frier? The Rashi should have said this earlier. This is not the first time that we encounter a pasuk that mentions 6 of the 7 nations. Within this same Chumash, we find it a number of times previously. Zweimal in Parshas Shmos, twice in Parshas Shmos, and einmal in Parshas Mishpatim, and one in Parshas Mishpatim. And dort is Rashi going to befarish, and Rashi says nothing. In Parshas Shmos, Perek Gimel Pasuk Ches, V'ered la'atzilam yad Mitzrayim, I went down to save them from Mitzrayim. I will go down to save them from Mitzrayim. And to bring them up from that land to a land of goodness and abundance. To a land flowing with milk and honey. And Gegashi is not mentioned. And then, just about 9 psukim later, and I said, I will raise them up from the suffering of Egypt. And again, Gegashi is not mentioned. And then in Perek Chav Gimel Pasuk Chav Gimel, which is in Parshas Mishpatim, the pasuk says, "Ki yelech malachi lefanecha," my malach, my angel, will go before you. The Aviachan is going to bring you. Elohim va'achiti va'prizi va'knani va'chivi va'yivusi v'chechadati, and I will banish them. And there's no mention of Gegashi. So this is 3 psukim, 2 in Shmos, 1 in Mishpatim. That the same thing happens. The pasuk mentions 6 out of the 7 nations, and Rashi does not address it at all. So the question is, if it's so important to address, why does Rashi not say anything? Here Rashi says it twice, and previously Rashi says nothing. So in Parshas Mishpatim, we can answer right away. In the beginning of the section in Parshas Mishpatim, it starts, I'm going to send an angel. So what's the context? Rashi is mefarish. Kan is basru, by the Eibishter telling them that he's going to send an angel. With this, he was informing them that in the future there's going to be a sin. And the Shechina is going to tell them, I cannot go up with you to Eretz Yisrael. I have to send an angel. That's how Rashi explains the pasuk about Hine Anochi Shaleach Malach. Was the Amira, does the Parsha say no? When does this happen? When does this actually play itself out? That the Shechina, the Yidden sin, and the Shechina says, I can't go with you. It's in our parsha, Parshas Kisisa. With Rabbi starting gesagt, lachrichet egel. With Rabbi says to Moshe Rabbeinu after the sin of the egel of the golden calf, v'shalachti lefanecha malach ki le'ela b'kirbecha. I'm going to send a malach before you, amongst you, because I can't go up with you. Und wie bald das mir sagt, als man wird lernen weiter Parshas wegen dem, and since Rashi in Mishpatim is indicating to us that we're going to learn more about this in a future parsha, which is in our parsha Kisisa. Verlasich Rashi eich in dem Prat was the pasuk rechend blaze of umes, of them was the taisvet of Parshas Senu. So Rashi relies there on what's going to be said here to explain this detail as well, why there's only 6 nations mentioned. This is a very simple, practical answer. With regards to Parshas Mishpatim, we know we don't have the whole story. So the fact that it says 6 and not 7 nations, we know that when we get to hear the rest of the story, we'll get to hear the answer to this as well, why it says 6 nations. So that's why Rashi says nothing in Mishpatim, because he's relying on what he's going to say in Kisisa. So that answers that question. Es ist aber nicht verständlich bei die 10 Mal in Parshas Shmos, wo der Pasuk rechnet durch Shish Umis und Lost durch Girgashi. But in Shmos they have 2 psukim, where the Pasuk mentions 6 nations and does not mention Girgashi. But was Rashi stellt sich dort nicht up of them, why does Rashi not stop and explain that over there? So we have now 2 questions. Question number 1, why does Rashi say the same thing twice in Parshas Kisisa? And number 2, in Parshas Shmos, why does Rashi not say anything? Okay, before we get to the answer, we have to first look at the 2 Rashis, and we're going to notice the differences between the 2 Rashis. We also have to understand the differences in the wording of the 2 Parshas, the 2 Rashis. They are 6 nations. Whereas in the second time, Vav Umis Yeshkan, the 6 nations we have here. There are 6 nations here. Base number 2, in the first Rashi, he says v'ha girgashi and the girgashi. Pirush HaBeis, the second time ki ha girgashi, because or for the girgashi. Gimel Pirush Aleph as a Messiah mipnei may love. Rashi ends that they left on their own accord. In the second Rashi he omits the word may love and doesn't say it. Dalid, back to the Dibra Maschil, and Ashton Mos Rashi might take from Pasuk Vigirashti es Aknani. The first time Rashi quotes from the Pasuk the word Vigirashti, and I will banish, or and I will expel. And the Satan Mos might take Blazes Amiri Unitin in Nigeris. The second time he just quotes the name of the nations, but doesn't say anything about banishing them. In that pasuk, the words would have been Hin Nigeris Mipanecha, but Rashi does not include that in the Dibra Maschil. He just begins with Es HaAbayri. So those are our 4 differences. Hein and Yeshkan, V'hagirgashi, Ki hagirgashi, May a love or no may a love, or Vigirashti and no Vigirashti. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do in Sifei is we're going to explain the difference between Shmos and Kisisa, why in Shmos something does not have to be said, and in Kisisa something does have to be said. The chilik zwischen die Psukim של Parshas Senu and the Psukim של Parshas Shmos Parshas Boy. The difference between the psukim in our parsha and those in Parshas Shmos and in Parshas Boy, the Rabbi here is referencing a ha'ara from earlier, where he mentions in the Parshas Boy also there's a pasuk that has 5 nations and 2 nations are missing. But the difference would be, we're also there, we're missing 1 or 2 of the nations, is the pashtus is very simple and practical. In Parshas Shmos, that's sich nicht wegen design umois geschlatsman. In Shmos, we're not talking about the nations, nor wegen their land. In Shmos, it's a geographical conversation. We're talking about the land, and we're identifying the land by where the nations live. The Rebbe sagt zu, als die Iden herausnehmen von Mitzrayim und bringen sie, let it stay, let it tavas cholov udvash. The Rebbe is promising that he's going to take the Iden out of Mitzrayim and bring them to a land of goodness and abundance, a land flowing with milk and honey, el mekoyim aknani v'achiti v'amori v'aprizva v'chiva v'ayivusi, to the place where these nations live. The second pasuk is, Allah eschem yoyni Mitzrayim, I'm going to bring you up from the suffering of Mitzrayim to the land of the Knani. To a land flowing milk and honey. We're taught with milk and honey. We're talking about a geographical location. There's no question why Rashi doesn't say all seven. What does is moving from Shata Pasuk. And his Maktim and Madgish he already said it's a land of goodness, a land of plenty, a land of flowing with milk and honey. We basically know where this space is. So as soon as he tells us the 6 nations, and we already know what the geographical location is, he doesn't have to say all the nations. We could add an extra detail over here, as the and why these and not the other ones. If it's just about a location, but Israel is beikir in the Maknaini, because this choice is part of Eretz Yisrael, that Eretz Tova or Chava, the land of goodness and plentifulness, etc., is where the other 6 nations were, and not where Girgashi was. So not only is it ever saying that I already know the geographical location at this point, I don't need to say Girgashi. Actually, he's saying something else, something more than that. That the best part of Eretz Yisrael was not where Girgashi was, and therefore he doesn't mention Girgashi because he wants to talk about where it is and how good it is. And therefore there's no need to mention Girgashi. That does not up the value of Eretz Yisrael. So Parsha Shmos, we're not even talking about the nations. We're talking about the land where the nations lived. And therefore there's no need for Girgashi to be said as long as I know what the Eibush is talking about. Parsha say no aber. Redt sich nicht wegen Eretz von die Umayis. In our parsha, we're not talking about a land, nor wegen dem Girush und Apollo von die Umayis Gufa. We're actually talking about their nations, about their expulsion, about their downfall. V'shalachti lefanach hamalach v'geirashti es haknaini v'gomer. V'meila daf Rashi da bavaron if I was memanded the Girush von Girgashi. Therefore, here all of a sudden, why doesn't it talk about the fact that Girgashi is also going to be banished from the land? This is a real question. In Shmos, there's no question. Once I know where we're going, it's good enough for me. But here we're talking about the expulsion of all of these nations. So why does the pasuk not tell us like Girgashi, who were inhabitants of Eretz Canaan, are going to be banished as well? So that explains the difference between Shmos and Kisisa. That in Kisisa, Rashi does have to address this question. However, Sivavi is going to say that the 2 different psukim in Kisisa are telling us 2 totally different things, which is why Rashi has to explain it twice, because in truth, Rashi is saying 2 different things. And like we said in the first paragraph, when the second Rashi is being a Tosfos Chidush Ubir, is explaining something new and different, Rashi does have to say it again for the new thing that's being introduced in the second Pirush. And the difference between the 2 Rashis will be understood by focusing on the difference in the Dibur HaMaschil and the difference in the wording as we brought earlier in the Sikha. In dem Gufe is aber da ein Unterschied von dem ersten Pasuk, we have the second Pasuk. In Kisisa itself, there's going to be a difference between the first and the second pasuk. Und der Chiluk wird angedeiht in die Wörter, and this difference is indicated in the words. Was Rashi is meitig from pasuk, but Rashi quotes from the pasuk. Im ersten pasuk is Rashi meitig die Wörter v'geirashti is haknaini. In the first pasuk, Rashi quotes the word v'geirashti, and I will banish. Dort redt sich wie der Eibishter wird übergeben die Umis in die Hand von Bnei Yisrael. The discussion in that first pasuk is that the Eibishter is going to hand over the Yidden, the nations into the hands of the Yidden. Wird vertreiben dem Knani, and as a weiter he is going to banish these nations. Father sich gleich bir, so immediately comes a question. Der pasuk redt da nor sechs. The pasuk rechnet nor 6. The pasuk lists only 6. The Azezah Yidden pater given from the Zibet Ruma. How did the Yidden get rid of, or how are the Yidden going to get rid of the 7th nation, Girgashi? Rashi. So Rashi clarifies. Shisha Uma is saying that in this pasuk he talks about 6 nations. As the Vegirashti Vatzitzich Taken to 6 Umas. That the Vegirashti, the fact that the Eibush is going to banish the nations, refers specifically to the 6. Und the Zibete and the 7th nation, the Girgashi, Amadu Panam Mipnei Me'elav, got up and evacuated on its own accord. It left. The Eibishter had to help the Yidden for the 6 nations. The 7th nation, Girgashi, left by itself. This answers the question: how will the Girgashi be gotten rid of if the Eibishter is not, if they're not in the category of the Girashti? And the answer is they're going to take care of themselves. That's the first pasuk. Schenken in dem zweiten pasuk kommt der Inyan Girush von the Umes. In the second pasuk, this idea about their expulsion comes behemshich to them was state freer, as a follow-up, as a continuation to that which it says earlier, you guard for yourself all of these commandments that I'm giving you today. And this pasuk is also a preface to divide to the future, to the later commands, where the pasuk is telling us about being careful to not learn from the nations and to destroy their idolatry and to destroy their altars, their mizbechos, etc. Das heißt, die Tere ist da nicht also ösen zu mitteilen sein dem Öfen Anhage von dem Ewigsten beim Vertreiben der Ummes. The pasuk is not focused here on describing how the other nations will be expelled. No, das wird der Mond als Akdama zu divide the Kitzvim zu Eden. It's just there, sort of as an aside, in order to bring up the future, the later psukim, which are the commandments to the Yidden. Und der Fahrers move on, as der stellt sich der Shaila. So now we have another question. Nicht genau, wie ist ein Potek von Girgashi? We're not asking how did they get rid of Girgashi, because we're not talking here about the expulsion. Nor here that we're talking about these commandments, for was der Mond dann nicht der Pasuk Girgashi, wie bald das divided die Kitzivuyim, seine Menegea zu alle 7 Umeis, Koil Girgashi. Why does the pasuk not mention Girgashi if these commandments, if these restrictions apply to Girgashi as well? So we have two different questions. In the first pasuk, the question is, how are we going to get rid of Girgashi? And Rashi says, don't worry, Girgashi is going to leave by themselves. In the second pasuk, we have a different question. Why does the pasuk not include Girgashi in these restrictive commandments that are seemingly should have been applicable to Girgashi as well? Before we get to Rashi's answer, and to see how Rashi's answer fits so beautifully into the words, first of all, this is why Rashi doesn't quote the words Hineni Goyrish Mipanacha in the Dibur HaMaschil, because it's not about the Goyrish. The whole concept of the expulsion is only an aside in order to introduce the commandments that are relevant to these nations. But in the brackets, the Rebbe is going to try to find for this and going to refute that answer. And then we're going to get to what Rashi answers. So maybe a very simple. The reason that the pasuk doesn't say Girgashi, because it does say Hineni Geirish, even though it's not the main part of the pasuk, but it does say Hineni Geirish, I'm going to expel. And we already learned a few psukim earlier that Girgashi is not going to be expelled by the Eibishter, and therefore the pasuk says the pasuk can't say Girgashi because Girgashi is not included in Hineni Geirish. Maybe that's why it skips Girgashi. It's actually a very brilliant answer. Weil says the Rebbe, that's not the answer. Well, number one, Aleph Hagu Fakash. Your answer is actually the question. Why would the pasuk say Hineni Geirish that would exclude Girgashi? Because the whole purpose here is to talk about these commandments that are relevant to all the nations. Our question is why is Girgashi not mentioned? So you're going to answer because it says Hineni Geirish. Don't say Hineni Geirish and tell me Girgashi. Why would the pasuk use the term Hineni Geirish if Hineni Geirish is a problem? Why would the pasuk use Hineni Geirish that would force me to exclude Girgashi when these mitzvahs are applicable to them, applicable to the Yidden with regards to them? Beis v'ikir. More importantly, beniden didan is masim der loshen Geirish v'penechach Girgashi. In this case, we could use Geirish, Hineni Geirish, even with regards to Girgashi. In the free, the pasuk Vigirashi Saknaini is moving for us Vigirashi Shlishtos Girgashi. In the first pasuk, we understand why Vigirashi excludes Girgashi. Because since that is the primary place discussing this uniqueness of the fact that the Avish is going to help with the other nations. The Dibber is that pasuk Kael to sein a Girgashi in Girush from the Vavumis, and therefore it makes sense to not include Girgashi in the expulsion of the other 6 nations. Because that would make us think that Girgashi was expelled in the same manner as the other nations, and it wasn't. That's not true. They left by themselves. Mashenkin in zweiten pasuk with the Girush from the Umas by Dermont Derech Agav. But in the second pasuk, where the expulsion is only being mentioned as an aside, but with Agdama as a preface to something else, canal. Unachtem wieder meves from freer Gigashi is part of Pneim, and since we already know that the Gigashi left on their own, is the Lashon Girush in the Girush Masamich like Gigashi. Now you could use the term Girush even with the eyes to Gigashi. But das was the Eibishter vertreibt the Umas. The fact that the Eibishter is going to banish the nations can sign of Kama Ifanim. It could be in various different ways. Including the fact that he will instill in them this affright, as he had placed that they run away on their own. So, when you're saying how it's being done, that the Eibishter is doing it, so you have to make sure to clarify that Girgashi was done in a different way. But now that we know that Girgashi was done in a different way, and we're saying he didn't need Gerish as an aside to something else, it could include Girgashi, because the fact that they ran away was also Hashem's doing. It wasn't Hashem's doing like a Milchama, like a war, but it's Hashem's doing. The fact that he felt that they were so scared that they had to run away is also done by Hashem. So in the place where you're talking about the actual manner of expulsion, so you want to clarify that it was two different things. But now that we already covered that aspect, that Girgashi ran away in a different way than the other nations, now that we're just introducing these mitzvahs that are relevant to the Yidden, that are on the Yidden as it relates to the other nations, then Hinni Gerish could include Girgashi, because even the way that Girgashi ran away was also a miracle of Hashem. So we're back to our question in Rashi. Rashi has to answer the question, why is Girgashi not mentioned in the pasuk if the contents of the pasuk does relate to Girgashi? The Rebbe Dr. Rashi, therefore Rashi says, as a time was that the reason why you have 6 nations here and why you doesn't mention Girgashi is vav umois yeshkan, because over here we have only 6 nations. Nor divav umois and b'shas haknisa la'aretz gan yeshvi aretz. At the time that the Yidden entered into Eretz Yisrael, there were only 6 nations that were inhabitants of the land. Und damit is move on, and therefore this will explain to us. You might make a treaty with the inhabitants of the land that you are arriving to it. You have to smash their altars. Now we understand why these commandments are said only to the 6 nations. Because with regards to Girgashi, it's not necessary to say anything. Because the Girgashi left. And now that explains. So first of all, that explains why he says Yeshkan and not Shisha Umois Hein, because he doesn't mean Shisha Umois Hein, that in general the pasuk is saying 6 nations. He's saying Shisha Umois Yeshkan. Here in Eretz Yisrael there are only 6 nations, and it's also understood why he says Ki Girgashi. Not the, but in the first pasuk, he's just saying what happened to Girgashi. The Girgashi, 6 nations had a war. The Girgashi left by himself. Here he's answering a question: why is the Girgashi not mentioned in the pasuk? And he has to answer because the Girgashi left already. Aber in die dann ist in Stamm, was die Zivuim sind da nicht negea zu Girgashi. Alpisa ist euch moving, was Rashi sagt nicht in zweiten Pirush. Arme de Partner Pnei May love. This also answers our third point. Why Rashi does not say may love, the word may love, because da ist nicht negea, sie das may love or nicht. How they left or why they left is not relevant at this point. Nor blaze them etzem inyan as Arme de Partner Pnei, just the fact that they're not there, and therefore it explains why the Tzivuyim are not being said to them. When the Pharaohs are not given in Klal for Yisrael, therefore he was not included in the inhabitants of the land. Be'eses at the Baaleh in the time when you arrived there. So let's go back very quickly and answer our questions. Why does Rashi say seemingly the same thing twice? He's answering 2 different questions. One, he's answering the question, how will we get rid of Girgashi? And the second, he's answering, why does the pasuk not say Girgashi if these halachas are relevant to Girgashi? Why doesn't he say anything in Parshas Shmos? Because in Parshas Shmos he's not talking about the nations. He's talking about a geographical location, and he gave us enough information to know what we have to know. Now, the Diyukim in Rashi, the first one has the Dibra Maschel V'Geirashti, and not in the second one, because in this first one he's talking about the Girush. The contents of the pasuk is about the Girush. Therefore Rashi says V'Geirashti. In the second Rashi, he's not addressing the Girush. He's addressing the mitzvahs that are there, and therefore no need to say Geirish or Vegirashti in the Dibra Maschil. Why did he say Vav Umis Heim versus Vav Umis Yeshkan? Because in the first pasuk, he's talking about the fact that the Eibishter is going to destroy the 6 nations. In the second Rashi, he's answering why the pasuk doesn't say Girgashi, and he answers because here, Yeshkan in Eretz Yisrael, only 6 nations. And that's why he says Ki HaGirgashi, because he's answering a question why Girgashi is not mentioned here. So he has to give a reason, Ki HaGirgashi, because Girgashi wasn't in Eretz Yisrael at the time. And that's why he doesn't say the word Me'ei Love, because how they left, if it was on their own accord or was in a different way, is irrelevant. Once they're not here, they don't need to be mentioned in the pasuk. So that answers the Rashi, and you see how beautifully the specific words of Rashi and the Dibur HaMaschil, what Rashi quotes from the pasuk, actually helps us understand what Rashi is talking about. And once we understand what Rashi is talking about, we understand why there has to be 2 Rashis, because Rashi is addressing 2 totally different issues. Now we're going to talk about a halachic takeaway from this Rashi. From the Yana B'Regel Halacha was bekan Reistam from the Pirish Rashi. Since Girgashi left, and at the time of the entry of the Yidden into Eretz Yisrael was not an inhabitant of the land, yes, lachker, we can debate whether these prohibitions and instructions that the pasuk gives us with regards to the other nations, do they apply lahalacha also with regards to Girgashi? Ubifrat in Fal when the Bnei Girgashi come into the Eretz Yisrael, especially if the Girgashi were to come back to Eretz Yisrael, we have the following debate. Do we say that what's most relevant is the time of entry into Eretz Yisrael? And since at the time of entry, the Girgashi wasn't there, therefore these mitzvahs, these instructions do not apply to Girgashi? Or maybe what is the deciding factor? Were they there at the time of the tzivui? The tzivui is now in Parshas Kisisa. That's when the Eibush is giving you the command. At this time, the Girgashi is still there. So maybe because at the time that the Eibush gave the tzivui, the command, the Girgashi were still inhabitants of the land, the mitzvahs do apply to them. All these restrictions have to be kept also with regards to the people of Girgashi. Do I say that because when the Yidden entered into the land, they weren't there, these mitzvahs don't apply? Or do I say that because when the Eibishter gave the command, they were still there, the mitzvahs do apply? It's a halacha question. From the way Rashi says there are 6 nations here in Eretz Yisrael at the time of going in Ki HaGirgashi Amad upon Repneim is mashma. This implies the fact that the commands were given only with regards to the 6 nations is their is because realistically they weren't only those 6 nations were there. Yeshkan Ki HaGirgashi Amad upon Repneim. This there's only 6 nations here because the Girgashi left. But inherently, the same obligations, the same restrictions apply even with regards to Girgashi. Especially since the fact that when the Eibishter gave this commandment, they were still inhabitants of the land. And therefore that does not stop to be applicable even afterwards if they left later. So in other words, the Rebbe is deducing from the words Yeshkan that Yeshkan is a practical thing. Why is Girgashi not mentioned? Because right now they're not there to talk to. But that doesn't mean to say that it doesn't apply. Fakert. Because during the Tzivui, they were still in Eretz Yisrael, therefore it does apply to them. And the Rebbe is deducing from this Rashi that la halacha, all of these restrictions apply also with regards to the people of Girgashi. And this explains why we find in Chumash Dvarim, the Eibush will give them into your hands. And you will strike them. Banish them. Do not make a treaty with them. Do not be favor. Do not be kind to them. Don't marry them. You should smash their altars. Over there in Dvarim, clearly it seems to include Girgashi. We don't have to force ourselves to say that those commandments are talking to Girgashi before they left, as some of the poskim want to say. Or with regards to the few Girgashim that remained spread out in Eretz Yisrael. No, you could say that it's talking about even with regards to the rest of Girgashi. And the reason is because since during the Tzivui they were there, they were in Eretz Yisrael, the Tzivui, the command applies to them as well. And the only reason why they weren't mentioned in the Psukim and Kisisa is because at the time of the Knisa La'aretz they weren't there. So it wasn't necessary to talk to them at the time or about that time. But inherently the same halachas apply to them as well. Now let's continue to the Yena Shel Torah. And the Yena Shel Torah is going to be an absolutely fascinating message. What's fascinating about it is how it fits in so beautifully into the Rashis. But before we can get to the Pnimi Yisrael, which is in Seif Yud, we first have to create another difference between the two Rashis in the practical, which is going to be in Seif Tes. The two different wordings that Rashi uses. V'hagigashi amad upon pneim me'elav. Un ki hagigashi amad upon pneim reden lechede wegen batzei besonder es mannen. By saying v'hagigashi versus ki hagigashi, it seems to imply that we're talking about two different time frames. Leitem ersten pirush shisha umesei. The first pirush says there are 6 nations. Vav Amoisif and Hagigashi Amad upon Pneim, and the Gigashi left. Is mashma as the Vegirashti had pale given after Shisha Umis, that the Vegirashti affected the 7 nations, the 6 nations that they were expelled. Umoisif Oich Oif Ula'achar, and in addition to that, following that, it says Nachdem Yakumin to Gigashi, when it came to getting rid of Gigashi, Hagigashi Amad Chulu, the Gigashi got left by themselves. In Lashon Ki HaGigashi, whereas if you say because the Gigashi Amad upon Pneim is Mudigish that doesn't give and far them in the Pipanacha. It happened before the expulsion of the other nations. There are only 6 nations here now. Ki HaGigashi Amad upon Pneim, because the Gigashi already left. And he's not included if you say Vigedashti, and I will banish and say the 6 nations. V'hagir gashi, as Rashi says, and the Gigashi. The Gigashi is also being expelled, just not by the Eibishter, is doing it by itself. So the Eibishter expels the 6 nations, and then the Gigashi goes away. If you say Yeshkan, Shishumas Yeshkan, there are only 6 nations here now. Ki, because the Gigashi left, implies that the Gigashi left first. But the Pashtas as they given the Seder Amaroy is the pale, and seemingly that is the second Rashi is how it was the chronological order of events. As even before the Yidden entered into Eretz Yisrael and went to war with the 6 nations, the Gigashi had already left. So at this point it seems to be a machlokes. The first period says that first was the war, and then the Gigashi left by themselves. The second Rashi, first the Gigashi left, and then there was a war, and the other 6 nations were banished. Says the Rebbe that we can answer this, that this is not a argument in what actually happened in reality, because we could say that Rubi Gigashi is a vegegain in Betchila. We could say that most of the Gigashi went away first, like the second Rashi, and a minority of Gigashi gemisht which were mixed in to the other nations, Pananachdem left later on after the war, the Ein Kan Mekoimei, and we're not going to elaborate on this. What we want to establish over here is that there's 2 approaches. Approach number 1 is, and in the order of the first Rashi, that first you have a war. First you conquer the 6 nations, and then Gigashi leaves, may a love, as we'll see, on their own accord. And the second Rashi is that exactly. And the second Rashi is that first the Gigashi, we get rid of Gigashi, meaning to say, Gigashi goes away, and then we have to still go to war with the 6 nations and expel them from Eretz Yisrael. And these 2 approaches we're going to see b'pnimiyus and yanim are two different paths in serving Hashem. First of all, says Yodua Zayin Umis Haknani who Hamedi v'Gemers and Zayin Midas Reis v'Chazayin and Zelu Umazef und die Zayin Midas Tikdusha. The 7 nations that inhabit the land of Eretz Yisrael, according to Chassidus, according to Pnimiyus and Yanim, refer to the 7 negative character traits that are the parallel of the 7 holy character traits. For example, Knaini is Chesed the Klipa. Knaini is the Chesed, the giving attribute of the negative forces. Chiti is Gevura v'chulu. Und the Linie von Kibur Zayin Umis, and the idea of conquering the 7 nations, is that Aveda to Koiv Zayin Umevar Zayin Zayin Midas Reis is the person's Aveda to conquer and refine his 7 negative character traits. See, I did my practice is the Midabas is Amanagit to the Midalu Masa in Kedusha, because each individual nation represents another negative character trait that is the counter to the positive character trait, and you have to conquer each one and elevate them and transform them to be used only for holiness and for goodness. Is Mavur in Sfarim, and the Sfarim explain the Inyan from Girgashi Parna Me'elav, the idea of Girgashi, which left by themselves, as the Girgashi is beginning from Malchus to Klipa. If you have, if Knaini is Chesed and Chiti is Gvura, you go down. Girgashi is the 7th. Girgashi represents Malchus of Klipa, of the negative forces. And after we rectify and refine the 6 nations, then Malchus is automatically rectified and refined. For Malchus is nukva de Klipa, but less lamigar maklum. Malchus, as we know, is the feminine attribute of Klipa. Malchus is always feminine. And Malchus, the Klipa, is the feminine aspect of Klipa. And Malchus is less than Migar Maklum. Malchus does not have anything of its own. Malchus receives from the levels above it and then relays it to the levels below it. But it doesn't have any of its own, so to speak. Since Blazim a Kabul from the Yachar Midas, it is a recipient from the higher levels. When as Vert bottled the Raf and the Vav Midas the Klipa, so once you destroy the negativity of the 6 midas that come before Malchus, automatically that cancels out Malchus of Klipa, because it has nothing to receive. It has no negativity to receive, because you already rectified the 6 midas that came before it. So that's how the Sfarim explain it. That it's interesting, in the Order 41, the Rebbe says that the reference in the Sfarim is from Kehelas Yankov, and the Rebbe says Leisata leMatzasi Pirush Inyan Zeh B'Sifrei Kabbalah Shlifnei Zeh V'Loi B'Drushi Rebbe Seinu Seinu. As of now, I have not found this discussed in any of the Sifrei Kabbalah prior to the Kehelas Yankov, nor have I found this discussed in any of the Drushim, any of the Ma'amarim of the Rabbeim. The Tzarech Iyun V'Chipus, you have to look into this and you have to find it. So now let's apply this more practically. The Inyan from Malchus the Klipa in Aveda is the beginning from Machshava Dibur Umaisa in Yanan von Umazah. The idea of Malchus the Klipa, the concept of Malchus the Klipa, is Machshava Dibur Umaisa. Meaning to say, Malchus is always the aspect, the level that takes from above and relays it to the next level, which is in a human being. When he has feelings, what does he do with those feelings? Either he thinks about it, or he talks about it, or he does something about it. That's already the Machshava Dibur Maisa, is the beginning process of taking the midas and applying them into the next level, into the real world. So Malchus the Klipa in Avodah is Machshava Dibur Maisa. When we rectify the 6 attributes. The midas chesed, for example, the midah of chesed. It shouldn't have any misguided love or lust or desire. Midas gvura, or for example, he has to rectify his midah of gvura, mevatel on the midah from kas, to get rid of his anger. And all the midas rois. When a person rectifies his midas, to get rid of all of the misguided, misdirected, or negative usage of the midas, so there's no room for negative thought, speech, or action. Tracht, redt, bedibur, und tut die meiste das, was die Midas willen, und seine Mechayiv, because Machshava Dibur Meise, are only the garments and the practical application of what he's feeling. He thinks or speaks or does that which his feelings, his emotions are telling him to do. But if you already rectified the midas are good, are not bad anymore, then the machshava dibur ma'isa are automatically going to be good. They're just going to reflect that which your midas are, and if your midas are conquered and rectified, then automatically the machshava dibur ma'isa is going to be positive. Aber die Pulu und Bier in Malchus the Klippe can sein if an Eifin. Oh, sorry, I knew this was going to happen. Und I'm a chayv. Adkan. This is one Eifin. Aber die Pulu und Bier in Malchus the Klippe can sein if an Eifin. As noch Eder as mevarim zachak ben seine midas reis. But there's another way to go, and that is that even before he conquered and refined his negative character traits, either kaivish yisroi, he conquers his yetzer as the midas roizon by him nitareis kumen im achshava dibur ma'isa, that despite the fact that his character traits have not been refined, but they still should not express themselves in achshava dibur ma'isa. Derach tevedu van abenini was der Rabbi bechol asmol is betalk with kutul dosei. This have taive lechol tanuge ilmazeh. They need to come kemiklau. Just like the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya about the Beinani, that the bad that exists in the left part of his heart, which is where the Yetzer Hara is still as intense as it was when he was born, and therefore he has all of these desires for the pleasures of the world, and it has not yet been removed. And is a chaber misgaber and shelut of the Beinani overpowers and takes control of the Ra, that it should not actually express itself in machshava dibur ma'isa. In other words, there's two ways to go. One way is that you conquer the midas, you rectify, you change, you transform your character, so that way automatically the machshava dibur ma'isa has no negativity to express. Or if you haven't gotten there yet, there's another way to go. At least focus on machshava dibur ma'isa to control that it should not express the negativity that it still exists in your character traits. Und das ist der Chiluk zwischen Pirush Rashi, and these two approaches in Avodah are the differences that we're going to see in Rashi, and watch how it fits in so beautifully into the words of Rashi. In dem ersten Pirush Ratzich, I can say the first Pirush is talking about the gradual, orderly entry into Eretz Yisrael, which is basically how the Avodah should go in the best case scenario. There kibush from bidur from design numis b'disrois, that you conquer and refine the 7 nations, the 7 negative character traits. But in them is the seder v'gerash tisak 90. First comes with afra treiben mevarad and the shishumidus. First, you have to banish the negative character traits. And then automatically, on its own accord, the Gigashi leaves. Automatically, this cancels out the malchus of klipa. The machshava dibur ma'isa in v'chazayin dich beslabish divav midas rois. The machshava dibur ma'isa in which the 6 midas rois would have expressed themselves, but because you won over, you conquered the 6 midas. Therefore, there's no more negative machshava dibur ma'isa. In the second pasuk, in the second pasuk, we're not talking about the order, the chronological order of how to enter into Eretz Yisrael. Das heißt, der Kibush und von Design das heißt, der Kibush und von Design midas nor bescheiches zu die Zivuyim was soll es zu iden. In the second pasuk, we're talking about the practical, the commandments that are relevant in practicality to the Yidden. Und die Avede von Teiro und Mitzvahs und der Choleration am Meiser Shayasun und Ela Shaloi Seyasena, wie es darf sein, die Machshava Dibur Meiser Shaloi. And when Teiro tells us what to do or what not to do, it's referring to not so much to the Midos, rather it's referring to Machshava Dibur Meiser. If Teiro says do not kill, it's not saying you're not allowed to have a thought of killing. It's not a good thing to do, but it's not a prohibition. There's no Isser al Pi Teira of Lo Sirtzach with regards to Machshava. When Teira says do or don't do, Teira is referring to machshava. I should rephrase that. When Teira talks to machshava dibur ma'isa. Teira doesn't talk to midos. Teira talks to machshava dibur ma'isa. Teira is not saying how you should feel. Teira is saying how you should think, how you should speak, how you should do. Und der Riber kann man doch nicht sagen, as Gigashi amad upon Pnei Meilav. And therefore you can't say that the Gigashi left by itself. Yes can. You still have the 6 umas here. The Raf and the 6 midas that the Klippe is doch betokvayu b'gvirasei v'chalas malikitul dasei. The negativity of his six character traits are still as intense as they were always. So it's nervous like Gigashi amad upon Pnei. The only thing you could do is you could get rid of Gigashi. To break away the actual machshava d'baraisa from the midas rois, from the character traits, that at least you don't, your thought, speech, and action is as it should be, even though the midas have not yet been transformed. But in brackets, even this really is dependent on the nefesh alikis. It does get them kayach as on litcheveren the sichlus from the klippas besit rachas b'chalas mali, which gives the person the strength to be able to push aside the foolishness of the klippa and the sitrachra. Kavur baruch and Tanya l'gabi abenini, as Tanya explains, when the fire zakman of them amadu panam bipneim svet nitchefar kedusos nefesh alikis. That's why it says it went away from before its face, from before its countenance, implying that it's not just the person's avodah by itself; it's actually with the power of kedusha that pushes it away. But nevertheless, it's still not it's still its own avodah, because the vav umas, the 6 negative midas, are still there. And since you still have the midas are still betokvam, they're still in their same intensity. Therefore, the pasuk says shmar lecha, ashmirim yuchedes, there has to be a special protection, as is on bayim nitpeilin in the midah hazayin, that it should have no effect on the 7th midah in the levushi and nefesh guf. You have to be constantly careful, because since the 6 midahs have not been refined yet, you have to constantly be on guard that the character trait should not affect the garments of the soul, the machshava d'baraisa, and the practical application. This avodah to refine the 7 midas is the achana v'achsharos and kibush and ala es rumes, is a preparation to the ultimate conquering of all the 10 nations. Oich keser chachmo bina, including keser chachmo bina. Does have a pale in the gul mitzvah shlema, which will actually be carried out with the geula ha'mitzvah shlema. But then we will have the 7 lands. And oich keni kriz v'kadmeni will also conquer the 3 other lands. Eretz Yisrael ha'shlema, the complete Eretz Yisrael. Yarchiv Hashem lekechas gevulcha, and the Eibishter will expand our borders. May it be because of mamish al yedei Mashiach tzedkenu. So we see from over here that how the 2 Rashis in the first Rashi says v'gerashti, that when you banish the 6 midos, then amad upana mipnei me'ilav, then automatically you're rid of Gigashi. But when vav umis yesh kan, if you still have the 6 nations here, you still haven't refined the 6 midos, then amad upana mipneim, then you could still conquer you can still overcome the machshava d'baraisa. Why? Amad upana mipneim, by utilizing the kayach of kedusha to push away the negative thought, speech, and action, and at least that will be okay even before you rectify the 7 midos of klipa, the 7 character traits. May we hope and pray to see the conquering of all 10 umas with the coming of Mashiach.